Thanks. Thanks a lot. And thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. This is the first time I'm in Bilbao. Well, I read with great interest the white paper on employment in Basque Country, and I wanted to actually relate the findings in this paper to the overall OECD job strategy, because there are many similarities between the main findings, the main challenges, and what we find for OECD countries. In particular, when it comes to the quality of jobs, the questions of inequality and inclusiveness, I think there are many similarities between the reports. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to explain what's the OECD job strategy. Then we'll cover its main recommendations and the main challenges for the OECD countries, and then I'll review some of the findings for Spain in particular, and recommendations, and this will also be the occasion to actually discuss some of the most recent reforms in Spain and how they relate to the challenges identified in the OECD job strategy. So what's the OECD job strategy? It's so the OECD is, as you know, a big forum of countries where we benchmark policies, we compare the performances of the economies, in this case, the labor market. We try to measure and evaluate as well, and find the good performers, also the good practices that lead to better performance in the labor market. So it's very much evidence-based. And there's been several processes over the last 30 years with this OECD job strategy. It started first in the 1990s with an approach which was very much around creating more jobs, because there was a lot of unemployment in the OECD countries at that time. So the strategy really focused on creating more jobs, and it was very much focused on flexible labor markets, flexible product markets. So it was mostly about flexibility. Then about 12 years after, there was a reassessment, and based on the discussion with countries, based on new data, based on also on new performance, there was a shift of the strategy from focusing only on job quantity, but also to job quality as well, to some extent. But most importantly, the main recommendation was that there's not only one way to roam. You can achieve very good labor market performance with very flexible labor markets, but you can also achieve good performances with labor market that ensure workers with a certain degree of protection, such as in the Nordic countries. So there's not only one model that leads to good performance. That was the 2006 reassessment. And then came the 2019 new strategy, which actually shifted again the focus even more to job quality, really, but also to a number of new challenges. Because what we saw over the last 10 to 15 years is a big change in what we call the megatrends. Most recently, I mean, not recently, but I mean, we really became very much aware of the consequences of climate change. But even in the years 2000, 2010, we saw an acceleration of the digitalization of the economy and the automation. And we also saw an acceleration of the demographic change in OECD countries. So these big mega trends actually ask for policies that focus not only on the quantity of jobs, but also on the resilience of our economies to cope with these big changes. How do you prepare your populations to these big changes? How do you prepare the workers for the new jobs of tomorrow? And so we introduced a notion of resilience and adaptability and also the notion of labor market inclusiveness that was really focused as well. Because over the last 20 years, what we saw also in the OECD countries is an increase in inequality, a divergence between high wages and low wages. And also, as I will show, and as Jan actually has shown just earlier, a decoupling between productivity and wages. So also a big focus on a labor market inclusiveness. So basically the main recommendations of this new, the key messages, I would say, of this new OECD's job strategy was that flexibility enhancing policies are really necessary to create jobs, but they're not enough to achieve good outcomes, notably in terms of job quality. And it's important to combine these flexibility enhancing policies with employment and social policies to really foster inclusiveness. And that actually requires a whole of government approach, because a number of the policies that you need to include people in the labor market to reduce inequality over the life course, or including also over generations, require policies in the field of education, in the fields of housing, social policies, on top of just purely employment labor market policies. So now let's turn to the main recommendations of this new OECD job strategy, and then we'll see how that relates to Spain. Well, there are three principles that really are connected to what I just said. The first point is really it's what we call the 3 Ps, doing a little bit of marketing. The first thing is a set of policies that promote an environment that creates jobs that are of good quality. The second point is really to prevent exclusion and to protect individuals. And the last point is to prepare for the megatrends. So the first point is about really creating an environment where you can have a growth of good jobs. And this is challenging to the extent that, as you've seen before, there is a decoupling between productivity growth and wage growth. Here you see the evolution of productivity on average in the OECD countries, which is a chart we are updating based on administrative records at the moment for all OECD countries. So what you saw for Spain previously is also true for on average for the OECD countries. So you see that actually you have a slowdown of productivity gains in the OECD countries, but also you see that this slowdown applies to wages as well. Not only real wages, but also and even more median wages, which means actually that there is an increase in inequality. Okay, so the productivity gains are slower, but the pass-through to wages is even weaker, which is the main challenge right now. And the evidence that we have for Spain and other countries shows that this trend is continuing. It has not stopped. The recommendations of the job strategy in this situation is first to basically have a sound macroeconomic environment that promotes the creation of jobs, but you need also to favor the creation of high productivity jobs. It's important for wages. And that means that a number of companies, especially in countries where you have a large share of small and medium-sized companies, need to be able to adopt the technologies that make them more productive, more competitive. So you need to have an environment that favors this adoption, which means enough flexibility, it's true, enough competition in the product market, enough flexibility as well in the labor market, because you need to change your work organization, you need to readjust, you need to reorganize your teams, you need to find new skills, recruit new talents to adapt to the new needs. So you need this flexibility. You need to also upskill the workers, and so it takes an upskilling and reskilling strategy. At the same time, these flexibility enhancing policies should be well balanced, and this is what we say in this OECD job strategy, is that some degree of employment protection for workers is really needed, needs to be moderate and predictable. It can be complemented with policies such as experience rating systems, such as in the US and now in France, where actually employers contribute to the social protection system or the unemployment insurance system in line with their turnover and the fact that they actually use a lot of short-time work, short-time jobs. And you should avoid that the burden of flexibility is completely shifted from employers just to employees. And the last point, which is extremely important, is that wage-setting policies are really essential. Even though you actually manage to boost productivity and to increase productivity, which is the main driver of wages, right? If you want to have good wages, you need to have also sufficient productivity in jobs. At the same time, it's not enough. Over the last 20 years, in a number of OECD countries, wage-setting policies have weakened in terms of wage negotiation, or in some countries, the level of the minimum wage has declined in relative terms. And so these wage-setting policies are really important to make sure that the productivity gains pass through to wages. And so it's about, the collective bargaining rules, the capacity to improve the coverage of these collective agreements, while at the same time protecting small firms. It's about the minimum wage policies, and I will talk in a minute about this. Now, let's turn to the second point, which is more linked to inclusiveness and inequality. What is really striking in the OECD countries is that despite all the policies that we have, the good policies in terms of education, in terms of social protection, we'll still have a significant degree of inequality across people, but also across generations. And what we see is that the social mobility and the capacity for sons of daughters of low-income households to reach the median or even above income in the country, so really to go up the ladder of income from one generation to the other, this capacity is relatively weak, even in our developed countries. So here you see the number of generations it takes for sons of low-income households to reach the level of the median level of income in the country. So it takes on average about 4 generations, a bit more than 4 generations in the OECD countries. And what's interesting is that, well, it's not the precise degree, so this is only illustrative, it's based on microdata and elasticities of income between sons and fathers. Why sons and fathers? Because daughters to fathers, it's more complicated over generations because the situation of women has changed so much over the last decades. So the comparison would be also more complicated to interpret across countries. But if we focus just on sons and fathers, we see a big disparities. So it means that basically there's no fatality. You can achieve probably a faster mobility with the right policies. So you see big differences between some emerging economy, Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, and some more advanced countries, some European countries, notably the Nordic countries, where you have a much higher social mobility, lower number of generations to go up that ladder. So to prevent labor market exclusion and protect individuals against labor market risks, you need to address problems before they arise, and this is what we say in this new OECD job strategy. It's better to focus on education first. I mean, initial education. It's easier than try to fill the gaps later in life. It's better to train workers over the life course on the job on a regular basis than trying to train them once they have lost their jobs. So it's really important to have this prevention approach to problem, to try to prevent rather than try to remedy the problems once they have happened. Also, another aspect which is important is to protect workers rather than jobs. If you want to promote this mobility, you need to have a sufficient number of opportunities in the market that happen over the life course. And at the same time, you want to help people reach to these opportunities. So it is important to have a good coverage of social protection systems to protect these people, especially the unemployment insurance system. And also to have a number of programs that really help people move from one region to the other or from one type of job to the other. Last aspect, and then I will turn to the situation of Spain, is the megatrends and the resilience. I talked earlier about the technological change. Here you see the share of jobs that are at risk of being profoundly changed by the digitalization and automation of our economies. So in the OECD, we assessed that about a third of jobs are going to be profoundly modified by these technological change, and about 14% are at risk of being purely destroyed. Probably replaced by other jobs, but in completely different sectors. So this technological change can actually lead to job creation in net terms, but these jobs are not going to be the same. And if the jobs survive, the tasks on the job are going to change. And this is what actually this chart shows. The problem is that those who are most at risk of losing their jobs are also those who are the least susceptible to participate in training that would be needed in order to move from the old jobs to the new jobs, or from the old tasks to the new tasks. So here you see the share of workers who in a given year participate in training, on average in the OECD countries. This is based on the PIAC survey that we run for adults every few years, actually. So here you see that, for instance, older workers are only 50% as likely as young people to participate in a training in a given year. Low-skilled workers, who are also often susceptible to lose their jobs due to digitalization and automation, in some cases, or only a third as likely as high-skilled workers to participate in training in a given year. And as I said, high automation, so workers working in jobs with a high risk of automation, also half as likely to participate in training as those who are in a job with low automation risk. So, so you need to prepare for the future, and so that actually in the labor market means that you have to scale up really the infrastructure for lifelong learning. And it's a challenge. It's a challenge because it's not easy to foresee the skill needs of company. It really takes an infrastructure to determine these needs. It's also a challenge because you have a number of barriers to training participation. Barriers on the firm side who do not always see the benefits of training, especially small firms. barriers on the worker side who do not have very often the time to invest while they're working. So invest in training, I mean, spend hours or weeks on training while they should actually do it, but they either don't have time or don't see the benefits. Or for those who need them most, need training most, they don't actually have, they don't feel like going back to the classroom. So you have a big barrier, which is psychological, but also sometimes financial, sometimes concrete in terms of the time availability to this lifelong learning, but it's absolutely necessary in the current context to invest in these infrastructure. And also it's necessary in this context to continue to adapt our institutions to the evolution of the labor market. What we've seen over the last 10 years is the development of new forms of work, the platform jobs, the gig work. This only represents a small share of jobs right now. It's about between 1% and 2% of jobs in the OECD countries. It's probably going to increase because there's more and more demand for jobs, for work à la carte, working by the hour, by the task, etc. This means that you need to change also a number of regulations, not only necessary to curb the creation of these jobs, but to make sure that these jobs actually benefit from the same protection than others. Because basically, when you work on these type of jobs in most OECD countries, you don't have access to unemployment insurance, for instance. You don't have any right for negotiating the wage. You're considered as an independent worker, as a small firm, so you cannot really organize yourself in the face of big companies. And so it really takes a lot of thinking and changes in your regulations to make sure that, yes, I mean, jobs are changing because of technology, but I mean, this technological change shouldn't actually lead to bad jobs, just terrible jobs with absolutely no protection, no rights to pensions, or very small rights to pensions, or no rights to unemployment insurance. So now, let's turn to Spain. So what we did is that we did a dashboard to place countries on these various dimensions. So here you see 3 aspects that are important: job quantity, job quality, and inclusiveness. And on this dashboard, all the indicators are rescaled so that when you're on the right side, you are a top performer. When you're on the left side, you are a low performer. All right? And each time we actually place the top performer, the lowest performer, the OECD average, and a given country. So that it's easier to read. So when we look at the various aspects for Spain, what is really striking is that even though the unemployment rate in Spain has declined dramatically over the last few years, and also has not increased during the COVID crisis, thanks to the job retention scheme, the ERTE, which is really novel, it remains high in comparison with other countries. So this data is 2021, but if you take 2022, it's not going to change because all countries are shifting in the same direction. Basically, and so the main challenge now for Spain is still to reduce unemployment and at the same time to increase labor market participation, reduce what we call the broad labor underutilization, which includes inactivity, also involuntary part-time work, and unemployment. So Spain needs more hours worked, more people into work. The quality of jobs we measure according to 3 dimensions. One is earnings quality, which looks at the median wage and also the average wage and also the wage distribution. Okay. Another aspect is labor market insecurity. That is driven by the share of fixed-term contracts, the probability to exit unemployment, and the level of unemployment insurance. And you see that here, because of the level of unemployment in Spain, because also of the high share of fixed-term contracts, at least before the recent reform, the labor market insecurity is relatively high in Spain. And another aspect is what we call job strain, which is the difference between the demands on the job and the means, your capacity to meet that demands. And in this situation, Spain is a little bit disadvantaged as well. The last aspect, which is really important, as I said, is inclusiveness. The first indicator is the low income rate, is basically the poverty rate at a threshold of 50%. And here you see that it remains relatively high in Spain compared with other countries. Definitely, I mean, the minimum wage reform might actually also have an impact on this. I'll discuss this in a moment. And also, I mean, Spain is doing better than other countries on the gender labor income gap. So it's called the gender labor income gap because it includes not only the gender wage gap, but also labor market participation of women. And so in this respect, you know, Spain is a good performer. A bit less good on other groups, such as single mothers, migrants, older workers, close to the OECD average, but a bit less good than for the inclusion of women in the labor market. So now let's turn to some of the most recent reforms and how they relate to some of the challenges that we saw. So one important aspect for both job creation and job quality is how you manage employment protection legislation. As I said, you need flexibility in the labor market in the sense that you need firms to be able to adopt new technologies to create new jobs that are more productive than yesterday. And at the same time, you want to avoid that this only passes through the creation of very short duration jobs, okay? Because that creates a lot of insecurity for workers. And also, this is also very costly, ineffective in the sense that because workers after a fixed term contract usually go to the unemployment insurance and claim their rights, also it can be also very costly for society because you have to pay them benefits, while actually they could have stayed with the same company for a longer period of time. So adapting this system of employment protection to leave companies enough flexibility, at the same time avoid that this flexibility only bears on the shoulders of workers and creates too much churning of jobs is really necessary. And this is what actually the reform of 2022 tried to achieve by rebalancing the protection of jobs, by allowing permanent jobs to be easier to use for a number of tasks, at the same time making short-time jobs, fixed-term contracts a bit more restrictive in terms of the kind of positions you can fill with these jobs. And here what we did, so we're conducting now a productivity review in Spain. And as part of this exercise, we updated one of the flagship indicators of the OECD, which is the Employment Protection Legislation Index. And here you see the index for temporary contracts only. So there's also an index for regular contracts. But here you see the index for temporary contracts, and you see directly the impact of the reform for Spain, which really increased the restriction on the use of fixed-term contracts. So you might actually think, oh, but then it means just more employment protection legislation, it's less flexible. At the same time, that can be successful if that really achieves a rebalancing between fixed-term contracts to permanent contracts, which the latest data seem to show that something is happening here, whereas actually the previous reform didn't really have such a big and rapid impact. Other countries have similar problems. You see France, Italy, for instance, that also tend to have, especially in France, a relatively high share of fixed-term contracts, much less important than in Spain, probably half as frequent as in Spain. France has taken another route compared with Spain. It's actually introduced an experience rating system. So firms can continue using the fixed-term contracts, but when they use it more, they pay more to the unemployment insurance fund. So they raised the cost of using these contracts in due proportion with their recourse, okay, compared with the practice in the sector. Another really important and very much hot topic right now is the minimum wage, and I couldn't avoid talking about this reform because the minimum wage in most OECD countries is really structural. It's really something that structures the labor market. And as you've seen, I mean, in the previous indicators, Spain tends to have a relatively high poverty rate compared with other countries. The minimum wage is a way to reduce in-work poverty. At the same time, you know that if the minimum wage destroys too many jobs, which is always a potential risk, the impact on poverty is not obvious because you could exclude people from the labor market if it's really too high. So what you see here is the very significant increase of the minimum wage as a share of the median wage. So this is an index that we use to see to what extent the minimum wage is really pervasive in the country. So here you see 4 different lines. The black line is the median in the OECD countries, okay, where the minimum wage is placed in the OECD countries. You have the top countries with the highest minimum wage as a percentage of the minimum wage, and the lowest. And you see that Spain now is really rising up to the average of the OECD countries. Okay, one thing. Very close now, and I think even more with the most recent announcement, to the 60%, which is the kind of a benchmark in the new EU directive on the minimum wage, so it's getting really, really close. And what we're seeing now, so I know there's a lot of evaluation ongoing and very recently, and so we are also evaluating the impact of the minimum wage in Spain. What we see is a big impact on wages and only a very, very small impact on employment. It's very interesting. At the same time, it calls for also more access to data, because what we've seen in other countries, and especially in France, a country that I know well because I'm French, you need to follow really the developments of the minimum wage increases on jobs and workers by different categories. It's these evaluations that are really macro evaluations are important, obviously, because this is the big picture. At the same time, you're applying the same regulations to everyone, and everyone is probably not placed in the same situation vis-à-vis productivity, vis-à-vis the capacity to absorb the increase. And so what we're seeing now in a number of countries is the creation of these minimum wage commissions or low wage commissions and their jobs is mostly to make recommendations to governments, but it's also mostly to provide evidence based on administrative records about, how firms adapted to the increase. How did they manage? Is it different for small firms and big firms? Is it different in the service sector and the manufacturing sector? Is it different for young people and older workers? And all this needs to be monitored over time in order to find the right tuning and the right pace of increase of the minimum wage. So this actually calls for further study and even more granular evidence on the impact of the minimum wage. And the last aspect that I would like to show you is that in terms of labor market resilience, as I said, Spain has really improved in this area. with the development of its job retention scheme during the COVID crisis, the ERTE. Compared with the previous crisis where unemployment increased, what was really striking is the only modest destruction of jobs during the COVID crisis, thanks to that job retention scheme. And what we did, we evaluated the impact of that scheme in Spain based on administrative records. And we used the fact that at the beginning of the COVID crisis, small firms had zero cost to non-worked hours, zero-hour jobs. They had zero cost to the recourse to the job retention scheme, while actually larger firms had a cost. Every hour not worked, they had to pay 6% of the cost. And so using this difference between the two groups, we showed that actually the firms that benefited from zero cost destroyed less jobs during the initial phase of the COVID crisis, and overall, over the total period of time, created more jobs. So they were more resilient to the shock of the COVID crisis than firms that had to pay a share of the hours that were not worked. And so that means that this type of measure can be really effective to accommodate big shocks in the labor market and really improves the resilience. So it's the specificity of Spain because the program was really big. It's also a specificity of number of OECD, especially European countries that have recourse massively, Spain, but also France in that respect. And also, which is really interesting, is that for the first time, that this type of program has also shifted from European countries to non-European countries in the OECD countries. So you see Canada, for instance, New Zealand, Australia using similar type of subsidies in a very successful manner as well. So to conclude, I think that what we see with this job strategy is that, well, Spain has made a lot of progress over the last decade or 2 decades, definitely, especially in terms of inclusion, I think, also in terms of transformation of its labor market. Still, there are challenges, notably in terms of the number of people into work, the number of hours worked. And so there's even more progress to be achieved in the coming years. Reforms happened, big reforms recently in Spain over the last few years. There is no fatality, I think. It takes time to change from one model of the labor market to another model. It takes a decade or 2 decades. But I think the example of Spain and other countries in the OECD countries with big major recent reforms shows that you can achieve a transformation that leads to jobs to better jobs and more jobs for everyone. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And as usual, I would like to share with you some questions, a couple of questions. First of all, well, you have shown us the level of the quality of the jobs in Spain, insecure, low-paying, compared with some other neighboring countries. Anyway, it looks like this quality is not limited to Spain. We can see the same thing in some other countries. So, what specific tools or your 3 Ps could be used to improve the wages for majority of citizens? I mean, is enough, for example, to promote lifelong learning, to raise labor productivity? Companies should play somehow a role in this. If it's the case, how?
Yeah. So I think the productivity issue is really important. It bears not only on workers, but also on firms. So if you want to have good wages, as I said, you need to have productive jobs, because this is the main driver of wages, productivity. It means that firms need to adopt the technologies that are needed. In a number of countries, we see that we have more and more top-performing firms, the champions that adopt these new technologies, but also a significant share of firms below the frontier that do not adopt this technology fast enough. And we have a growing divergence between the top performers and the other firms. And this is really what is really striking and drives a number of also inequality results and a slowdown of productivity growth. So we need to help firms adopt these new technologies, and it's important especially for small, medium-sized firms. That is not enough, because also what we see now is that a number of firms in the COVID crisis have accelerated the adoption of these new technologies. They realized that being digitalized was really was really a key in the COVID crisis to be able to maintain your sales. And so they're adopting, but they don't find the right skills. We have labor shortages all over the OECD countries, in Spain in particular, but other countries as well. And so the skills are really important in this respect. The skills are really important, especially in countries where, well, in some countries you have 3% of unemployment, so it's very difficult to find new workers. You need to reskill the workers in place. In countries where you have about a 10% of unemployment or even 7% of unemployment, like in France, you think, okay, I have workers there, okay, so I need to be able to incentivize them to take new jobs, but also to train them, because in a number of cases, firms say that the primary problem that they have is that they don't find, it's not that they don't find candidates, they don't find skilled candidates for their jobs. So the skilling and upskilling is really important. And the last aspect I think is really, that I mentioned, is the fact that even though you have even though you have productive jobs, it's not certain that this will translate into higher wages. Because over the last 20 years, because we had low inflation, which obviously is, we are in a different world now, but we see the consequences. The labor market wage institutions have been basically, in some sense, weakened. There was less interest for workers to belong to unions. And so what's really important, and the minimum wage as well, was in a number of countries a bit weakened. And so what you see now is that there is a need really to also reinforce social dialogue to make sure that, especially for the low-skilled or medium-skilled workers, the productivity gains translate into better wages.
Different measures, not that at all. May I ask you for an extra effort, the last one? Could you please put it shortly, the key elements for a country to have, let's say, high and sufficient employment levels? Just the key elements, because we've seen there are a lot of them. What should they be?
Well, I think that, well, in my opinion, especially in the case of Spain, to be and the Basque Country to a large extent, even though you have specificities in Basque Country, I think the big reform that happened in terms of employment protection legislation is really important to shift from fixed-term contracts, very unstable, to better contract. And I think it's really important for firms as well to shift from that model. And the second point is really education and training. I think these are the two aspects that are really important for me, especially in the context of Spain.
So focused on that, those are the key, let's say, takeaways. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and to be here.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you so much.